This has been May, and I want to thank you for being with us as we continue to seek the old paths. We are trying, by going back to God's Word, to call people back to the old paths, because that's where the good way is. We are studying now in the final book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. I don't know all the meanings of all the things that are said, because God does not reveal them to us. I can't tell you all the little details, but I can tell you this. The message of the book is God wins. And the second theme of it, I believe, is overcome. Overcome. When Jesus was addressing in chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation, the 7 churches of Asia, every church was encouraged and told, overcome. Probably the most well-known verse is in chapter 2 and verse 10. Be faithful unto death, and you will receive the crown of life. Be faithful unto death. Well, that had a very special meaning to those who were particularly the ones God had in mind when He had John to write the message He was seeing in heaven. And so Jesus Himself is revealing this message to John. He calls John up into heaven and shows him these grand images. The point is, no matter what Satan tries to come up with, he is no match for God. And so we have seen that illustrated in so many ways. The angels play a prominent role in this vision that John is seeing. And we are seeing a lot of groupings of the number 7. And we have just finished last time about these 7 bowls of wrath that started being talked about really in chapter 15 and verse 1. These 7 angels having the 7 last plagues. Now I believe that what is written here in Revelation primarily is for those early Christians who were suffering terribly from Roman persecution. That lasted for 200-300 years. 200, a little over what? Between 200 and 300. It started with the Emperor Nero. And the message again is, be faithful unto death. And so we see it unfolding and pictured in these vivid images of the scroll sealed with the 7 seals. And chapters 1 through 12 talk primarily about the things that are happening on the earth and how God's people are being persecuted, how they're being put to death. About the souls under the altar, for instance, in chapter 6. How long, O Lord, how long till you avenge our deaths? They gave their life for their faith. And so we see it, on one hand, we'll see by the end of chapter 12, signs of victory. And then we'll come kind of back up now. Let's see what was happening in heaven, behind the scenes. And so we have seen that portrayed as the dragon representing Satan, the earth beast representing the Roman Empire, the sea beast representing the worship of the Roman Empire, of the emperor worship. And then we're seeing this another character that is called Babylon, the great harlot, representing the sexual immorality that was so common around idolatry. And then we see in chapter 15 how these, now the last plagues, we're going to get to the end, to the victory. Now not the end where the Lord comes back for the final judgment. That'll be talked about at the very end of the book. But that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about his kingdom being established. He's talking about his people persevering. He's talking about the gospel continuing to spread all over the world. Satan tried to stop it, but he lost. Now he still tries to stop it, but he can't do it like he once could, or he thought he could. He's locked up in the abyss, in the bottomless pit, you might say. And we'll talk about that when we come to that section. He's going to be released for a short time before time is over. But the things in Revelation will have already happened before that event happens. And so we start seeing these bowls of wrath being poured out. We got down to the last one, to the seventh one. And we find that and when the sixth bowl of wrath is making way, the Euphrates is pictured as being dried up, so the kings of the east could come. We're picturing these forces being gathered up to fight against the Lord, as if they had a chance, but they don't know that, evidently. And so, verse 16 of chapter 16, and they gathered them together to the place called in Hebrew Armageddon. Now we're going to see, this is not going to be a long battle here, the way it's pictured. The way God views time, it didn't take very long. When we think about Armageddon, I want to talk now about that. It was an actual place. Here's a map, and I know it might be a little hard to see, but I've got circled in the middle a place called Megiddo. That's the form of the word Mageddon, Armageddon. And it was a real place. And so, as much of the language of Revelation is, it goes back to the Old Testament to draw the imagery from. Everything from the sun being darkened, the moon turned to blood, the mountains quaking, being leveled, all of that language right out of the Old Testament. Even the beast that they're seeing, language right out of the Old Testament. And so this place, this Battle of Armageddon, that so much is made about. Oh, there's so many fanciful doctrines that come from this, and we're just going to share what the Bible says. How about that? And then you take that and you judge whether these ideas you might be hearing match what the Bible is saying. And so let's think about some things. Again, there is a place called Armageddon, or Armageddon. It was a literal place. In fact, it's the Bible speaks geographically of Megiddo, which again is the form of that word, and Joshua chapter 17, verse 11. Megiddo and its towns are the waters of Megiddo, the valley of Megiddo. All of these are mentioned in these passages you see listed here. Now, no mention is made of Mount Megiddo, not saying there wasn't one, but in the Old Testament it's not mentioned. Megiddo was an important place, though, because it was a strategic place. If you were going to try to defend your country and you wanted a place that was a good place to see the enemy coming, that was one of them. And so it guarded the northern entrance of Israel. There were a lot of battles that happened there because it was a strategic place, and the armies, the enemies, would come through there often. And so there were several battles fought there. Deborah, who was a judge, and her captain Barak, they fought against Jabin and Sisera of the Canaanites. And with God on their side, they won. And then Gideon. Remember that wonderful story about Gideon? He started out with 32,000 soldiers, and God whittled that number down to 300. And with that 300, he defeated and drove out the Midianites. Then you had King Saul and his son Jonathan. Well, unfortunately, that's where they were killed, was in that area of Megiddo, or Armageddon. And then you had Ahaziah, the king of Judah, who was in league with Joram of Israel, which never should have happened, but that's another story. He died there in that area at the command of Jehu, who was taking over the northern kingdom, at God's command, by the way. And then you had one of the kings of Judah, King Josiah. He fought against Pharaoh Necho there, where he died. And so it was not always a place of victory for God's people, but it always fit God's plan. King Josiah should not have gone against Pharaoh Necho. Ahaziah should never have gone in with Joram, king of Israel. Saul and Jonathan. Well, Jonathan was caught up in it. Saul was unfaithful. And so there were times that they won, God was on their side. There were times that they lost, God was not on their side. And so it was a well-known place of doing some great battle. And so given the history of the area, then John evidently used the word symbolically to describe a great decisive spiritual battle between the army of Satan and the forces of God, which would determine the fate of each. Remember, the seventh bowl of wrath, the last plagues, were being poured out. We've seen the first six. And now the seventh is being poured out. And it's pictured as once that's poured out, it is said, it is done. Now, he's going to go on and describe this in more detail. We're going to see it there in chapter 16. We're going to see that, and starting in verse 17, after he talked about Armageddon in verse 16, and in verse 17, then the seventh angel poured out his bowl. The end of the verse says, it is done. And now we're going to see various things described over the next couple of chapters. But it's done. When God pours out that seventh bowl of his wrath, it's over with for his enemies. The battle was fought and won by the Lord and the complete defeat of the Roman Empire and paganism. Now, that doesn't mean the Roman Empire just suddenly went away. But the persecution against God's people did, and in fact, Christianity will become the official state religion of Rome. It never had the leadership, the emperors that it once did after God wins the battle. Now, to look for a physical military battle between human armies to be fought in northern Palestine at some future date is completely without scriptural support and foreign to the spirit and purpose of Revelation. God's people would not be comforted with a battle that now 2,000 years has gone by and it still hasn't happened. How was that helping and comforting God's people back there in that persecution? That just wasn't the point or the purpose of the book. Now, let's go on, and let's remember now how closely connected chapters 12 through 22 are. And so let's just look at the highlights again. Satan is in direct conflict with God. He calls upon his agents to help in his fight. Well, those agents at this point in time was the Roman Empire. But God is in control. He judges each one of Satan's agents, and then Satan himself, God wins the victory. By the end of chapter 16, God has judged the beast of the sea, which was the persecuting government that had really been an agent of Satan. The beast of the earth, which was the false doctrine that had enticed the masses of people to worship the first beast who was working for Satan. It is called the false prophet because, or he's called the false prophet because it's a false religion. Now, the dragon, Satan himself, is not yet judged by the end of chapter 16. That's coming later. We see the judgment of something that is inevitably intertwined with Satan, with the persecuting government, and with false religion, and that is gross immorality. As chapter 17 begins, an angel calls John to see how the destruction that has been brought by the bowls of wrath has affected the wicked harlot Babylon. Now, we introduced her earlier, so we would see the main characters, remember. And so, once that idolatry is being beaten back, being defeated, then the immorality that so often accompanied it with fertility rites, fornication, all those kind of things, revelries, drunkenness, well, that's being defeated too at that time. And so beginning with chapter 19 and verse 11 and going through chapter 20 and verse 15, we see the judgment of the only one who is still remaining to be judged, and that was Satan himself. He and his agents are going to be sent to their final destruction. The judgment is complete and final, and after the judgment of the dragon. Then it's time for the marriage feast of the Lamb. Oh, the chapter ends on a high note. God shall wipe away every tear from every eye, and so on. And so what do we see? We're seeing Babylon the harlot, that representative of gross immorality. And we're seeing when a government denies God, and when false religion gains the support of a persecuting government, then there's no basis for morals. People sink to their lowest level possible. Again, I've said this several times. Although the message initially were to those Christians suffering under the Roman Empire's persecution, the message applies to all time. And can't we see it even in our own country? As a nation, it drifts further and further from having the Bible as its foundation. How little do you hear about the Bible anywhere in the secular world or in the political world? And I understand they're inherently separate, but at least the people demanded that their leadership be moral people. And the people demanded that there were standards. So we don't want such and such on TV. And now or movies, and you're seeing that being eroded away. Used to be a marriage scandal would ruin your political career. Not so much anymore. It used to be Christians. There are a lot of things Christians would never engage in that you see happening more and more. And so people are sinking to their lowest level when you as a society are turning away from God. And so this immorality is personified as a harlot named Babylon. Now references have already been made to Babylon. She's already been judged as God was judging the two beasts. But she's not really identified until chapter 17. So one of the angels who poured out the bowls of wrath tells John to come and look more closely at the judgment that's being wrought upon this great harlot. And so from chapter 17, 18, then that description is given. The great harlot that sits upon many waters, she covers the earth. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her. Their lives are totally corrupted by immorality, is what he's saying. There's not a literal woman that they literally have been with. It's the sin that she represents. The masses of those who dwell upon the earth are drunk with the wine of her immorality. It just becomes an addiction. And so he's observing this harlot for what she really is. It describes her as riding or sitting upon a scarlet beast that is full of blasphemous names, that has 7 heads and 10 horns. That kind of sounds familiar to the great red dragon, doesn't it? And the beast of the sea that we've already talked about. The woman is clothed in the richest of finery. Oh, she looks like something would be enticing. Purple and scarlet. She is adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. She's drinking from a golden cup. I mean, she's just riding high, literally. Her name is proudly proclaimed upon her forehead, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. Harlotry was often used to represent idolatry and fornication, turning away from God. And so by the golden cup she is drinking from, that golden cup is full of abominations. I mean, it looks good, it looks enticing, but if you really look at it, it just represents all things immoral. She's already drunk with the blood of the saints and of the witnesses of Jesus, those who have proclaimed his story to the world. She was very much opposed to, and she reveled in their defeat, or either in their deaths, rather. And John marveled as he's seeing her. Well, as John is seeing her, then we have the description that identifies it with the dragon and with the beast. Therefore, Satan and the wicked government that serves him, they're all tied in together with this great harlot, because it all leads to the gross immorality. The beast who was and is not, and is about to come up out of the abyss and to go to destruction, is talked about in chapter 17. The description is used in contrast. You think about what was said about God, who is and who was and who is to come, a sign of eternity, and yet of the beast, of the dragon, the beast, it is the one who is and who, let me find my place. The beast who was and is not, as opposed to God who is and who was and who is to come. And so it's an awesome beast, but it's definitely headed for destruction, in contrast to the Lamb who will overcome. And so we're seeing the downfall of these that seem so powerful and so mighty. Well, these that we find who were not written in the book of life, they stand in awe of the beast. And again, I see that today. People just don't see any harm in pushing God out of society. They don't see any harm in not worrying about being married, or getting divorced as many times as they want to, or drinking as much as they want to, or doing drugs as much as they want. They are in awe of all that lifestyle. Now, some kings have come and more will follow, but they all have one common purpose, and that is they serve the dragon. All these economic forces come together to support each other. And in a way of supporting each other, then they are inherently fighting against the Lamb who is opposed to all of that. But now, we have language that talks about the kings, and people get all caught up in trying to figure out exactly which emperors were these. You have 5 have fallen, 1 is, and there are others to come. And the point is not to identify those. The point is that they each in turn have given themselves totally to Satan. But they're not going to succeed in defeating God. Yeah, you had some, you have some kings, you got some more that's still to come. So we know that it's not over yet, you got more to come. And though the beast is fearsome, and though he has some mighty forces, it looks like on his side, what are these Christians hearing? I know it looks unsurmountable, but it's not. The Lamb will overcome because he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And those who are on his side are the chosen and the faithful. Now, the waters where the harlot is sitting, as she's depicted there, represent all the people, the multitude, the nations, and the languages. That is, people from all the earth are caught up in her immorality. And so in God's purpose, the beast who has been her ally will become her enemy, until the words of God shall be fulfilled. The people and governments who have become addicted to her will grow to hate her and seek to destroy her. It's all well and good as long as things are going well, but as soon as they see, that's not going the way that suits me, then everybody turns against it, to kind of separate themselves, that maybe they won't get caught up in the destruction. And as our country becomes more and more given to immorality, there is greater and greater outcry against the battle, the battle against crime, without stopping to think, well, what caused the crime to start with? It's the lack of God in our society. The woman is the great city that reigns over all the kings of the earth. In other words, it's her influence, that gross immorality, that's represented by this woman, the great harlot, Babylon. Totally given to be an agent of Satan. The same fate awaits any government that becomes Satan's tool. So finally we come to chapter 18. Been kind of going over, again, this is more an overview. It's not a verse by verse study at all. But again in chapter 17 we have one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls. So let me show you the great harlot. And she is shown, and then those who had been supporting the beast and all that are going to turn against them as things start going bad. Verse 14, these will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them because he's the Lord of lords, and so on. And then in chapter 18, after these things, okay, so we're still in that seventh bowl of God's wrath that we started back at in chapter 16 and in verse 17. This is still describing the ending of all these powerful forces that were against God's people. And so what do we have proclaimed here? Fallen is Babylon the Great. Her influence that has contaminated the nations and the kings and even the merchants. Why, they're all falling under God's wrath and under those bowls of wrath that he's poured out. And then he said, another voice spoke from heaven. John's hearing a lot of voices speak from heaven, isn't he? And so it says, I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, lest you receive her plagues. In other words, they're all falling. Get away from them. Don't get caught up. The end is near. The persecution is almost over. And so come out of her. Don't share in any of that. Notice that this is a call to my people. My people, come out. God is calling his people to come out from the immorality of the world around them so that they will not share in the judgment. Remember how God wouldn't let the four angels who were holding the four winds proceed until he had sealed each of his people with his mark? And then he talked about those who had the mark of the beast, showing they were following Satan. And so my people, God is protecting his people. You come out from among them. Remember the passage, come out from among them and be separate, says the Lord. And so God doesn't want his people caught up in the fall of these forces. And so in verse 7, chapter 18, give her that much suffering and sadness. She says to herself, I am a queen sitting on my throne. I am not a widow. I will never be sad. So these disasters will come to her in one day. Yeah, she didn't think she can fall. She didn't think God can do it. And again, I don't know why Satan thinks that. But he does. And notice that as God is pouring out his wrath, it says it's double strength. And so back in chapter 14, those who had given their allegiance to the beast, his image, and to the harlot Babylon were given the wine of God's wrath unmixed, undiluted. Imagine how it is to face his undiluted wrath. In fact, it's described as double strength. That's the fate of the one described as Babylon, the harlot of immorality. Those whom she has deceived now stand back because they don't want to protect her, as we mentioned before. The kings of the earth who have participated in her wickedness weep and lament over her plague, but they stand back in fear over her torment. Woe, woe, the great city Babylon, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. How quickly God turned things around for his people. The merchants who had gotten rich, they weep and mourn, but they don't come up to help her. And so they're grieving more over their own inability to sell their wares and make money than for her suffering. The shipbuilders, the sailors who brought goods are mentioned. They stand back in the same way and say, who is like her, but now laid waste. So this is God's vindication of your stand for the truth against all odds. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, because God has pronounced judgment for you against her. And then the very end of chapter 18, a strong angel took a millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, this is like Babylon being thrown down. There would be no sound of music, no sound of joy. All the nations who were deceived, for all the nations were deceived, and in her was found all the blood of the prophets and saints who have been slain upon the earth. Oh, what a great fall it was. And that brings us to the end of chapter 18. When we come to chapter 19, we're really starting to see the victory now. And I encourage you to be with us, Lord willing, next time, as we come to the final lesson in this great series. And as always, seek the old paths.